Hello everybody, welcome to another system programming class. Today's topic is macroprocessor. Yes, so far we have completed the first unit, which is going to be the introduction. So we are using IBM 360 and we are going to program using IBM 360. And second unit we discussed about assemblers. The third unit is macroprocessor. So what is the work of the macroprocessor? Assembler, you know that it is used to assemble your assembly level language program into machine level language. So what does the macroprocessor do? Right? The work of the macroprocessor is to expand the macros. So what do you mean by expanding the macros is, first of all, you should know what do you mean by a macro. Macro is nothing but your functions. Functions you write, you call them as macros. It's like your functions. So remember a function. Say for example, fact is a function, factorial, finding factorial of a number. So what are the components? First of all, there will be a place where you define the function. Yes or no? And there will be a place where you call the function. So I just wanted to uh, remind you of these things which you already know about functions so that you will be able to relate it to macros. So first thing is you will have to define a function and then you have to call the function. So what happens when you call the function? For example, I have defined a function called factorial. Fact is the function. I have defined it. Then in my main program, inside my program, I'm going to call the fact. Okay, so I'm going to pass some parameters and call it. Okay, so what is involved? There should be a function. This time it is going to be a calling function. So we are going to call fact. So calling function here is nothing but fact is the calling function. So you will pass parameters. Again, it depends. You can also call functions without parameters, or you can also call functions with parameters. Okay. So let me again say in terms of system programming what the whole thing holds in microprocessor. So let's see the terms. First term is your function here is called as a macro. Okay. The function here is called as a macro. So you define a macro. That is the first step you do. You have to define a macro. Secondly, in your program you will call. So it's called as a macro call. The call you do, you call the function. It's called as a macro call. Right? So you can pass arguments inside the macro call, or it is without arguments also, it's fine. So you can do these things. So first of all, you should know how do you write a macro. Secondly, how do we call the macro? What happens when you call the macro? Macros can be called with or without arguments. So these are the basic things you should know about a macro. Right? So let us go into the program. Right. Go into the topic. But before that, I wanted to tell you, so okay, defining a macro fine, calling a macro is fine. What is the work of the macro processor? The work of the macroprocessor is to expand the macros. So what it does is, whenever you load your program, so you want the program to be executed in your main memory. So you have your macroprocessor. What is the work of the macroprocessor is, it will expand your code. So what happens, for example, there is a fact function is written or macro fact is written. Then there is a macro call fact I'm going to call. So whenever there is a call, what happens is your microprocessor work is to copy that function wherever it is called. So the actual definition will be copied here. Yes, it is going to be copied inside your macro itself, right? Something like your inline functions, right? So what is the use of doing so? First of all, I would like to ask you one question. Why do we use functions? Okay, so I know you'll be answering this that if there is a repeated code, you don't have to repeat it again. If it is written in one place, you can call it whenever it is required. Yes, agreed? Yes, but when you expand it, what happens? The whole purpose is not there. But what happens when I call it and I don't expand it? Say for example, I call fact. What happens? Actually, what happens by default? My cursor has to go to that function, execute that function, and come back to the main program. Okay, I repeat it. In my main program, whenever I call a function, whenever I'm calling a macro, whenever there is a macro call, the cursor has to be transferred to the actual macro. It has to execute and then come back to the main program. It is seen as an overhead. It is time consuming also, right? So this is the disadvantage of it. What is the advantage of that is you can save memory because only at one place the macro is there. So you don't have to again and again call it, and you don't have to occupy a lot of memory because the number of times you call and you expand it, that many times it will be available. So you are wasting the memory. Okay, so that is okay. Now what we see is whenever situations wherein our memory, we have enough memory, wasting memory is not a problem, but you want to increase the speed of the processor. You want to increase the speed of the processor, then you go in for this macro processors. So microprocessors are necessary in those cases. Right? That is the work of the microprocessor. This is just a glimpse of it. Let us go into the subject. It will be more clear for you. This topic is very simple. Just you should know a little basics, then you can go a long way. Right. So first of all, what is a macro? How do you define a macro? I told you first of all a macro should be defined and then it has to be called. So this screen only talks about macro definition. This screen is only going to tell you how do you define a macro. Whenever I say macro, you can imagine a function. Okay. Right. First, every macro should start with this keyword called macro. Macro keyword should be there at the beginning of every function. So that is the first thing you should take care of. And another thing you have to remember is every macro will end with this keyword called macro end, end, MEND. End is nothing but you are saying that the macro is ended. This is how you define a macro. This is called macro definition. So let's take for example, first if I have to write a macro, first I have to write this keyword macro. And then next line I have to write the name of the macro. Okay, name of the macro here, let us say I told you fact, no, one example I gave you was fact. So let us see here the same example is what we are going to use throughout. So let us say the name of the macro here is INCR. Okay, the name of the macro is increment INCR is the name of the macro. It can be anything. Your example can have any name, any macro name you can give it as an example. So any macro function can be written. I'm sorry, any function can be written with any name, same as that of C and C++ and all. Here also, this is the example we are going to see. INCR is the macro name we are using. So what is that macro used for is, so this macro has 3 lines of coding. Let us see the first line of coding is you have data. Okay, data is stored. Data, let us assume data is nothing but your symbol. The value is going to be stored in the end of the program. So as we have already seen programs, you know that. It's like your variable. So data is going to contain some value. The first line code A1 comma data tells you that add the contents of this data with the contents of this register 1 and store the result in register 1 itself. And store the result in register 1 itself. Right? So add the contents of data to the contents of register 1 and store the result in register 1 itself. Same goes on. Add the contents of data to register 2 and let the sum be in register 2 itself. Similarly, add data and register 3's contents. So this is the code. So you are going to add data with register 1, data with register 2, data with register 3. That's all. So INCR is a function written to do this operation. And then you are saying end. So macro is ended. Right? So this example you have to remember, it is very important. If you can remember this example, theory you can write it in your own words. Not a problem. You have to say that these keywords should be there. What you mean by macro name and what you mean by the coding sequence of instructions which is inside that particular macro. This is the definition part of it. Macro definition. Yes. So let us move on from this. Next, the concept here. The actual concept is in this particular slide. I have defined a macro. So what is next? Yes, you should know 2 things. How do you call a macro and how do you expand it? Okay. Let us just see only the calling part first. Let us skip the right hand side of it. Let us only see there, whatever is there in that box is nothing but your macro definition. Okay, I have defined the macro. Right? So I'm going to say I have done it in the beginning of my program. I have defined a macro. Right? After that, there is a program. The program is continued there, and there is some place where I am calling the macro. INCR, I am calling the macro. Okay. So this macro, particular macro, there are no arguments. You are just calling that macro that will be executed, and then it will come back to the next line of the program. So it has to actually what happens? It has to go there, execute, and come back to the main program. So that is the meaning of it. This is what I do. I continue with the main program. Then again I am calling the macro second time. Okay, it is going to go there, execute and come back to the main program. This is what will happen actually. By default, this is what is supposed to happen if you are not using a macro processor. If you are using a macro processor, things will change. Right? So again, the program is ended. Then comes the data part. I am declaring all the datas here. So data, DC, okay, define constant. I am going to give the values here. So data, I am going to give this data as F5. Okay. So this is going to be F is going to tell you one full word. Right? So this is the program ends then. Okay. So let us assume this is going to be your main program. First you define the function, then you go on with the main program. There are 2 places when you make a macro call. INCR, again INCR, you are doing a macro call 2 times in the main program, and then the program ends. You understand? So this is what happens. This is your main program. This is how it looks like. After microprocessor does its work, okay, what happens is the microprocessor work is it will take the source program, it will see wherever there is a macro call, that macro call will be replaced with the code. Say for example, see here, INCR is the macro call. So whenever your microprocessor is able to see a macro call, right, what it does is it has to expand it. How does it do? It sees what is the program which is written inside that macro. There are only 3 lines of coding. So INCR will be completely what? It will be replaced with this code. INCR is going to be completely replaced with these 3 lines of code. So that is called as macro expansion. So when you do that, what happens with the mode after the main program? So there is no differentiation between the program and the function call or the macro call. The next lines will be these 3 lines will be executed, then the rest of the program will be executed. Again, the other 3 lines which is in orange color will be executed, and then the main program again, and then you end the program, right? So this is how the program looks after it is expanded by your microprocessor. The microprocessor work itself is to do this. Why is the microprocessor doing it? In order to avoid the overhead in transferring your control to the macro and then coming back. In order to avoid that overhead, your microprocessor is expanding the macro so it makes it into, merges the program and the function into one. Okay, that is what it does. Merges the main program with your macro, right? This process is called macro expansion. So by now you should understand 3 things. First of all, what is a macro and how do you define it? First of all, what do you mean by a macro and how do you define it? Second thing you should know is what do you mean by a macro call? Okay, so this left hand side, the whole thing is going to be what you do during a macro call. So during a macro call, you write a macro and then call it in your main program also. Okay. Third thing you should know about macros is how do you expand a macro. This is called macro expansion. In macro expansion, you have to directly take the name of the macro and then have to replace it with the coding which is inside it. Okay, you want to replace with the coding inside it and then continues with your main program. So this is what you do, right? So yeah, now the question is how will your microprocessor know that there was a macro? Microprocessor work is it will read the program line by line. Okay, whenever it sees the keyword macro, it stores that macro. INCR is the macro, it stores that macro. So it will know that how many macros, a macro keyword, how many times it is used, that many macros are there, it knows. So that many times whenever those macros are called, it has to replace it with the code. That particular macro's respective code has to be replaced. This is called macro expansion, which is the work of your macro processor. Yes, let's move on. Right. As I told you before, so macros can also be with arguments, right? So it is after all a function. So it's like our functions which we use in our other high-level programming language. It is same like those functions. So macros also can have arguments. So now what are we going to see? How can a macro have an argument? What happens if it has an argument? How will the expanding macro expansion be? And what are the different types of having arguments? So all these things we are going to see. Yes, hope you understand. So first of all, you should know what is a macro, what is a macro call, what is a macro expansion, and then now we are going to discuss about what are the different ways of having macros with argument. Okay, first we will start with a simple argument. Okay, just one argument is what we are going to start with. Once we understand the concept, then we will go to the complicated macro arguments. Little complex arguments we can understand. We will be able to understand. Right. First thing, this is your macro. So here, see again. Let me just give you a summary of what we saw already. Macro keyword should be there. And then you can define a macro. I have defined a macro called INCR. Only difference between before the one which we have seen in the previous slide and this is that this has arguments. Right. So INCR is the name of the macro, and it has argument here. Ampersand ARG is nothing but your, that's ampersand ARG is nothing but your argument. So you can replace it with any argument. When you pass any data. Okay, it is the same concept as like your functions, right? This is your passing parameter, right? So what will I do with that argument is, instead of using data, so I use data, right? Usually I use data, there is only one data. What if there are many data, many different types of data, and every time I wanted to use a different data when I call this macro. That is why I wanted to have a argument parameter also there. So depending on the argument parameter, the code will change like this: a1 comma whatever is the argument, a2 comma argument, a3 comma argument. Okay, so let us see the example so that you will understand. So this is a macro with an argument. So let us go to the macro call. See the macro call incr data1. Okay, here the argument in this particular case is data1. See the next one incr data2. In that case, the argument is data2. So you can call the macro, but the argument need not be the same. You can have your argument of your choice, whichever you wanted to have it as an argument. Every time you call, you can change your argument. That's why you need this argument value. Otherwise, what happened? Again, see on the previous slide, let us see what happens here. If whenever I call incr, it only adds data is one variable or one symbol. It only adds that value to register 1. Okay, now see, first time it adds one symbol, data 1 is a symbol name, it adds that value to register 1. Second time it is adding another symbol, data 2 value into the register 1, and so on. So you can have different arguments. So that is the whole point here. Understand? Otherwise it's the same thing. Okay, so let us see the macro expansion part. If the argument is data 1, then what happens? A1 comma data 1, A2 comma data 1, A3 comma data 1. If the argument is data 2, then the expansion will be A1 comma data 2, A2 comma data 2, and A3 comma data 3. So this is going to be the expansion. This is how the macros gets expanded. Yes. So you understand this? This is going to be macro with argument. Let us move on here. To this example, it is again macros with argument only. Here you can see two things, right? So what are the two things you can see here is, first thing is, see, first leave that lab, that is a label. Let us leave that. I wanted to first explain this argument part. See here I have argument 1, argument 2, argument 3. Okay, but when I am calling, you can see that I can choose any order. I can say, first time I am going to say incr here. So if you are not able to see it, wait a minute, there it is. Okay, here you can see the order is changing here. First time when I call incr, I am going to say data 1 comma data 2 comma data 3. That is the order I want. Second time when I am calling it, okay, so though I have 3 arguments, I have the 3 arguments in different order. Okay, what we observe here, first macro we saw did not have any arguments at all. Second macro example we saw with the previous slide had 1 argument. This example we are going to have more arguments. That is the first thing. First thing is that it is going to have more number of arguments. So for example, this particular example has 3 arguments, right? Argument 1, argument 2, argument 3. So that is point number 1, right? So what is the second point is, so I am going to use, instead of using the same argument for everywhere, there will be situations where I wanted to use different arguments in different lines of coding. Can you see that, right? So different arguments I want to use in different lines of coding. So with register 1, I want to add the argument 1's value. With register 2, I want to add other argument 2's value. With register 3, I want to add argument 3's value. In that situation, I will go in for 3 macros now. Okay. So what is the message here? You can have macros without arguments, with 1 argument, or with more arguments also. You can have your macros written. Yes, that is the first. And one more thing here is, see, this simple thing here says, I will call the macro data 1, data 2, data 3 are 3 different arguments. So one data 1 I am going to add it with register 1, data 2 I will add it with register 2, data 3 I will add it with register 3. Okay, that is the plain and simple way. But what have you done here? The order of the arguments is data 1, 2, 1, 3 is the order. In the next time when you call the same macro, it doesn't have to be the same. You can say incr data 3 comma data 2 comma data can be the arguments. Okay. So how this is useful is, in my program I will check, okay, for some reason I will check if the data 1 is the largest. If data 1 is the largest, I wanted to have it like data 1, 2, 3. If data 3 is the largest, then I will want to have it as 2, 3, 2, 1. If 2 is the largest, I may want to have it like, so depending on which is the largest, I may want to change the order. Okay, it's just the necessity of my program. Okay, so you can do that also. That also is possible. So how do you do that? By changing the order here. Calling function, you can change the order. So here it only says argument 1, 2, 3. right? So when you're passing this is the passing parameter, this is the passing values, you're passing this value, right? So dummy arguments you're passing to the actual parameter. So that's the same thing, concept holds true here also. It's the same concept only, like your functions and arguments, right? Second thing I want you to notice here is usually in other programming languages, we only will have the passing parameter here. Inside the bracket, you'll call a function. Inside the bracket, you'll have parameters. That's it. But here there is another choice. The parameter can also be a label. The passing parameter can also be a label. So that is also one of the arguments you can have it here. So we have 4 arguments in this particular line. Argument 1, 2, 3, and there is another argument called label lab1. So that is another argument. So why is that important is, again in the coding you can change it. I can say if my condition is satisfied, then go to loop number 1. If my other condition is satisfied, go to loop number 2. If my other condition is satisfied, go to loop number 3. So for that purpose you can use this label. That a label again can be an argument. So label can be an argument and again can be placed either like this. Okay, here also you can place it, right? Or you can also place it here. You can say comma label. So that also allowed. Argument 1, 2, 3, comma label also is allowed. So there are 2 ways to use labels. Label in macros is also considered as an argument. Okay, so this is one concept. So how do you write in your exam? First they may ask you about what is a macro. Okay, so 5-mark question you have to write what is a macro, what is a macro call, what is a macro expansion. Sometimes they give, this is a very important question. Sometimes they give in your question paper itself what is a macro, explain macro call and macro expansion. So this is one set of questions you will have to, questions will be asked. You have to answer it together like this. Second thing is, what do you mean by macros with argument? Then you have to say what do you mean by having one argument, what do you mean by having more than one argument. Now you have to also say how do you change the order of the argument, and you can also have arguments with this label. These are the things you have to say. Apart from that, there are also different types of arguments which we are going to also see in the next slide. So these are the things you have to explain. You understand? So what is a macro? Macro call expansion is one question. Second question can itself be explain arguments. The macro arguments or macros with arguments. That is going to be another question. That's how it is going to be asked in the exam. Let us go to the next slide and see what are the types of macros. Here, first type of macro with argument is called as positional argument. Okay? And second type is called as keyword arguments. What do I mean by positional argument? This is the default type actually. So whenever I have INCR, A, B, C, these are 3 are the parameters for me. Okay, when these 3 are the parameters, it obviously means that I will have to add A to what? Register 1, B to register 2 and C to register 3. This is directly it is understood. Okay. So what is the problem here is, the argument has to be matched with the dummy arguments. Like for example, my dummy arguments are x, y, z, which means A, the meaning of it is A is equal to x, B is equal to y, C is equal to z is the meaning. So I am saying, so this my dummy arguments are x, y and z. Then what happens whenever I make a call, I will say INCR x, y, z, which means it has to match itself with the actual macro definition. It has to replace ABC with X, Y, Z. So that's how the concept works. So it indirectly means A is equal to X, B is equal to Y, and C is equal to Z. So this is the thing. But what if the programmer is not aware of the order? What if they are going to change what if there is a problem in knowing what the order is, how the program is written? We don't know when we are passing the parameters, we may not be aware of that. Or we wanted it to be in a particular way. So we wanted it to be in a particular order, we don't want to mess up with that. So how do you do that? Is you have to use something called as a keyword argument. In keyword argument, you can directly say whatever order you give. Okay, always A is nothing but your argument 1, C values argument 3, and B values argument 2, or anything else. So I have given another example. So you can see argument 1 is equal to argument 2 is equal to A. A is argument 1 and argument 2. C is going to be argument 2. I'm sorry, argument 3 it should be. So C is going to be argument 3 is nothing but your C. You can say that. So keyword argument, you have to directly assign the variables or your symbols in this case, directly assign the variables to that particular argument so that there won't be any confusion. Okay, so the values has to be directly assigned. This is called as a keyword argument. Okay, so again repeat, we have 2 types of arguments. One argument is just you have to give directly without any assignment. The equal to sign will not be used. It is nothing but your positional argument. but you should be very careful with the position. Okay, you should be very careful with the position with the dummy argument values. Right? If you are not very sure about what is the position, then you can always go into a keyword argument type, wherein the name as well as the position is important. You are going to give both. You are going to assign directly. So what is the actual parameter and what is you are going to be a passing parameter? You are going to directly give it in the function call itself. So you are going to say when I am calling it, I am going to say argument 1 is equal to A, argument 3 is equal to C, argument 2 is equal to B. So what I am saying. Or else let us say another example I will give you. INCR A is equal to 10, B is equal to 25, C is equal to 30. Values also you can directly get. You understand? This is how this works. This is called keyword argument. Right? So what have we seen today? We have discussed what you mean by a macro and what is a macro, how a macros are called. Okay, this is just the programming part of it. This is the programmer's part is programmer should know how do you define a macro and programmer should know how do you call a macro. That's all is the work of the programmer. Then comes the second part, which is nothing but what does the macro processor do? Whatever the programmer has written, the macro processor work is to expand those macros. So it will have to make a note of how many macros are present and then replace those macros with the coding. So that is the work of your macro processor. That step is called as macro expansion. Right? Then we saw how can you have arguments in a macro, or the different ways of having arguments in a macro. Whenever arguments of a macro is asked in the exam, you definitely have to write positional argument and keyword argument with the example. Write two lines of explanation and then give an example and then explain the example also in your own words. Right? So I think this is enough for today. So we will continue it in the next class. Continue the other topics of macros in the next class. Thank you.